The 9 words. What? That's right. The 9 words that are quite common to hear around many major Jewish holidays, maybe jokingly, but historically and traditionally accurate and culturally accurate. And now is the holiday of Purim beginning for Jews around the world. Well, in Israel, the holidays are already beginning for many people because usually in the run-up to Purim, kids in Israel spend the week in school celebrating in different ways, and then by the time the actual holiday arrives, they've already done quite a lot of Purim celebration. Anyway, and then of course the holiday is at the beginning of the next week, starting over the weekend or so. And depending on whether someone lives in a walled city like Jerusalem or Tzfat or Jericho, then there would be an additional day called Shushan Purim. And in any case, what are those 9 words? If you know them, go ahead. I'll give you a moment to write it in the comments. No, I'm just kidding. Nobody watches these videos anyway, right? Right? You don't share or like or comment and then say, okay, why do I put these videos out then if nobody watches them? Well, mostly for my own satisfaction. So what are the 9 words that many people say around certain Jewish holidays, and especially around the holiday of Purim? As well as Hanukkah, by the way, especially Purim. Well, those 9 words are: they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. I'll say it again. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Now, you might find it funny as a joke. You might find it not at all funny. You might hate people for that. If you do, you shouldn't. Hate is a bad thing, and it's also a waste of time. But there are many people who, are passionate about the Jewish people one way or the other, like them or not like them. And, well, there you go. That is a cultural kind of joke about Jewish holidays, because so often throughout history, it is a case of people who hate the Jews tried to kill the Jews. The Jews won, not in that they survived and their enemies didn't. And so let's eat. Let's feast, right? And I realize that there are people who are probably, very passionate about what's happening in the war between Israel and the Arabs in Gaza right now. And they're probably fuming if they hear this sentence. How dare you joke like this when the poor Palestinians are starving, they'll say. Well, okay. Let's break that down, shall we? So the Palestinians in Gaza, anyway, we'll call them the Palestinians in Gaza, were receiving some amount of food aid trucks until October 7th, until the war began, as part of their normal routine delivery of food aid that UNRWA was receiving and in theory distributing, but in reality it was being stolen by Hamas and resold on markets for higher prices. Well, since October 7th, Israel has actually increased the number of food aid trucks that go into Gaza by 80%. That's right, 80% more food being delivered into Gaza now than there was before the war. 80%, right? Nearly double. Not quite, but nearly double the amount of food aid going into Gaza. So if they weren't starving before the war, and there's almost twice as much going in now since the war began, how are they starving? And if on top of that, and this is kind of a grotesque statistic, but if these statistics are true, that 30,000 or so people have been killed in Gaza since this war began, which is a horrible number, but, if you believe that number because you believe it for whatever, reason, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Personally, I don't take statistics from the Hamas Ministry of Information or Ministry of Health as sacrosanct or holy or factual, because, well, they're liars. But let's say those numbers are accurate, okay? If there's 30,000 less people there eating now, that's 1.5% of the population fewer than before, and you have 80% more food than before the war. So there's less people and more food. How are they starving? And if you're going to say to me, well, look at those photos of the starving baby, the dead baby that starved to death. It's like in the Holocaust. The Jews are performing a Holocaust on the Palestinians. Okay, well, did you know that photo and that series of photos and many other photos like it since the beginning of the war have been debunked as fake? That's right, they've been using rubber dolls, and they've been using other images from people as far away as, well, Syria, next to Israel, where they have their own civil war since more than a decade, and where people are actually suffering at the hands of the Assad government, and we're obviously suffering at the hands of ISIS and other terror groups during this awful war that they've been having for 12, 13 years or so, and where you have more than 600,000 people dead, okay? And those are by numbers on both sides, claiming those numbers. So you have more than 600,000 dead people in Syria in the last 12 years of fighting or so, and not a word, not a peep about how those people are starving to death or actually suffering a genocide at the hands of their oppressors, which are actually the Syrian government and a bunch of terrorist organizations running around fighting them. Right? And they're slaughtering civilians wholesale, not using any kind of humane methods to fight their war, just absolutely devastating cities and towns and villages without, any care at all for, collateral damage. It's just wanton destruction, right? But no, that doesn't bother the people who hate Israel. What bothers them is when the Jews are winning a fight, right, or when Israelis are winning a fight, right? And lest ye forget, 1 in 5 Israelis is Arab, right? Which means there are a lot of Arabs who are in fact pro-Israel in Israel, okay? And in fact, a bunch of them serve in the IDF. And in fact, a bunch of them have also suffered immeasurably at the hands of Hamas during October 7th. And many soldiers who have died, include Arab soldiers since the war began. And why does that matter? It matters to show you that, first of all, Arabs are not a monolith, just like the Jewish people are not a monolith. No people are a monolith. People have different opinions and views. And that's all wonderful and part of a healthy world of discussion and debate. And democracies thrive on the fact that people have different views. As opposed to if you look at, places where they do not allow having different views publicly, and where people who share their views, if they're different, and if they share them publicly, they get severely punished or mistreated or abused or imprisoned or unalived, as they say on YouTube. So why is it that when the Jews and Israelis are winning fights against the people who launched attacks against them, the world is up in arms? Oh no, your response is disproportionate. Let me remind you that if the Hamas had their way, they would have killed every single man, woman, and child in Israel if they could. Obviously, statistically, they didn't really have any high probability of doing that, but they caused as much carnage as they possibly could, and they plan to do it again and again and again. They've said so publicly multiple times. And you have the overwhelming majority of people in Gaza who, before the war, supported Hamas, and since the war began, support Hamas. And if you say, well, having this war is just going to make the problem worse and exacerbate Palestinian hatred for Israelis, and it's going to cause more of them to attack Israel, Let me just remind you again that most Palestinians living in Gaza were already brainwashed and hateful of Israel because Hamas and the Palestinian Authority had been brainwashing them for decades, and their education system teaches their children to hate the Jews from their very earliest days. So there is no, we could have made the situation better by not attacking if you were Israel. Israel was going to be hated by the Palestinians whether they responded or not. If they hadn't responded, the Palestinians would have been more energized to commit further acts immediately. And they still continue to attack with Israel with rockets, by the way, to this very day. They have not relented. And if Israel had, continued to prosecute the war the way it is doing now, well, it would be the same responses we're seeing now. So either way, Israel would be hated by its enemies. It makes no difference whether or not they're prosecuting the war aggressively or in a docile fashion, unfortunately. And here's the thing. I am not one of these people who thinks that Israel should just continue to prosecute the war ad infinitum and that Bibi should stay in government. In fact, I've written about it in the Times of Israel newspaper from the very beginning of this war, that Bibi should be out of government and held accountable for his problems and held accountable for the things he's responsible for that very likely caused this war to happen in the first place. Okay, so I am not a great defender of the extreme right-wing government nonsense. Okay, but I do believe that Israel has to defend itself, and I do believe that Israel has a right to defend itself, and I do believe that Israel has a duty to defend itself. And is there a proportionality in war? Arguably, maybe. However, it certainly is the case that Israel is beset by enemies on two fronts, if not more. And the Hamas, being an actively aggressive and violent enemy, which has sworn to try to annihilate the state of Israel and kill all the Jews in Israel and around the world, needs to be defeated. Otherwise, this war will be perpetuated. Now, is it possible to get rid of every Hamas fighter? Maybe not. However, is it possible to win a war against an enemy and have them get rid of their ideology? Yes, it is. It happened with the Nazis. It happened with Imperial Japan. It's happened throughout history with countless sides of wars losing and forgetting or dropping their ideology and changing their ways. Very often it happens that they lose those ideologies and change their ways within a matter of a few short years. Sometimes it takes a generation or two, but it certainly cannot happen while that side remains undefeated in the sense of they are still around for the fight. They're defeated constantly in battle after battle and war after war, but as long as they remain a viable fighting force in any capacity, they're going to remain a problem that has to be dealt with. Until that ideology of hatred that stems from the Palestinians of Hamas, until that ideology is removed, until they accept Israel's existence, until they drop their ideology of hate and change as a people, unfortunately, this terrible war is going to go on. Whether it's the current hot activity happening in Gaza, or if this even calms down with some kind of a ceasefire, if all the hostages are released, then you'll see more attacks will happen, more terrorist attacks will happen, and more Israeli responses will happen. And it's an unfortunate truth, and it's a terrible truth, because frankly, if even one person in Gaza dies unnecessarily, and if one person who's innocent dies unnecessarily, it's a terrible, terrible event, terribly tragic, just as it is if one person dies unnecessarily due to violence or terrorism in Israel, or anywhere else for that matter. Terrorism is awful, and it should be stopped. But fighting against terrorism is a necessary, unfortunate result of having to get rid of terrorism. And if you say to me the occupation has been going on for 75 years, I will tell you no. There hasn't been no occupation for 75 years. The Israelis were not occupying Gaza between 1948 to 1967. The Israelis, you can argue, were occupying Gaza between 1967 and 2005. But others would say it was not an occupation. Those were disputed territories, and Israel was settling the land there with colonies or settlements. And after 2005, Israel left Gaza. So Israel has not been settling Gaza for now nearly 20 years, for 19 years. It left 19 years ago in 2005. So what does that tell you? It tells you that for the last 19 years, Gaza has been run by the Arabs who live there, the Palestinians who live there, the Hamas who live there. And they have done nothing, unfortunately, the Hamas have done nothing to help the Palestinian people in Gaza. They've notably built a bunch of tunnels, hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, and built a bunch of rockets out of the aid that they received from the European Union. It took literally water pipes to build rockets to attack Israel. Why? Because they figured that it was better for photos to show kids, starving or thirsty, right, dehydrated like crazy because they couldn't get access to water easily, than it was to show kids who are doing well and thriving thanks to the EU aid. Why? Because the Hamas has no interest in seeing the people of Gaza thrive. They view them as pawns to subjugate to their cruel and oppressive ways. They don't want a democracy in Gaza, the Hamas. What they want, all they want, is to annihilate Israel. They don't even want a Palestinian state. They just want to annihilate Israel. They don't want a Palestinian state because a Palestinian state, by definition, a modern Palestinian state, would be secular. They don't want a secular state. They want an Islamist state. Don't forget that Hamas is part of the Islamic Brotherhood, founded in Egypt, and they want Islamism. They do not want secular Arabism. They do not want modern Araby. They seek only death and destruction. That is their ideology. And until that ideology is defeated, unfortunately, this terrible war is likely to continue. So on that terrible note, I will end this live stream and wish you all peace and prosperity. And may we all see the end of wars and actual peace and prosperity and the brotherhood of men and women and children all over the world. Cheers. Shalom. So long.